The program will begin in 5 minutes. Please find your way into the auditorium and take your seats. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones and devices. Everyone, please take your seats. The program will begin momentarily. Please welcome to the stage Tony and Pulitzer Prize-winning composer Michael R. Jackson to sing from his Broadway musical, A Strange Loop.
Time in history. Dad is drunken on the couch from money to pork chop. Daily treadmill, won't ever stop. One lone black gay boy I knew chose to turn his back on the Lord. One lone black gay boy I knew chose to turn his back on the Lord. I am lying on the couch, I dream that I'm flying, flapping both my wings so hard to keep me from dying, with a crown of God's forsaken thorns on my head. Like all those black gay boys I knew who chose to go on back to the Lord. All those black gay boys I knew who chose to go on back to the Lord. All those black gay boys I knew who chose to go on back to the Lord. And one lone black gay boy I knew who chose to turn his back on the Lord. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage the Atlantic's Nicholas Thompson.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. I'm Nicholas Thompson. I'm the CEO of The Atlantic, and it has been an awesome 3 days. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Michael R. Jackson. Thank you to performers. It's been tremendous all the way around. And thank you to everybody who's been able to come to these events and to go out on the wharf where somehow we've been able to take it from either boiling hot or freezing cold, but nothing in between. We've had great conversations. We had that debate last night about the classics. I hope you were there. I hope you were there to see Thomas Chadden Williams. I hope you were there to see a wonderful way of people engaging. And then the rap battle afterwards, that was amazing. I can't remember exactly how it went, but I do remember the line, "That's enough from you, Socrates. Time for you to get on your knees." Just beautiful. And you guys have been the best audience. I taped an interview on Tuesday, and I made a slightly off-color joke, and it didn't land in the room. And then they showed the video here, right? And you guys all laughed. And so you've truly been the best audience. Anyway, we have another fabulous day coming up. And I'd like to thank you for being here. We're going to have all kinds of great conversations on stage. But before we get started, I want to thank our underwriters who support this. And without underwriters, no Atlantic Festival, or at least no fun Atlantic Festival. So if you see an underwriter, give them a hug. So at the presenting level, we've got Boston Consulting Group, CTIA, Pfizer, Southern Company, and the Walton Family Foundation. Our supporting level underwriter is KPMG. Our contributing level underwriters are Allstate, Edward Jones, Genentech, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Omidyar Network, and Penguin Random House. So thank you all. And then last couple practical notes before we get started. Please silence your cell phones, but keep them on and keep tweeting. The Wi-Fi, I don't know if you have cellular access in here, but the Wi-Fi is Arena Guest with a very secure password, Arena Guest. So please join, tweet hashtag TAF22. I've been tweeting up a storm. Hope you guys all tweet up a storm too. Enjoy the show. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Constance Wu, actor, producer, and author of Making a Scene, with Atlantic staff writer Shirley Lee.
Thank you so much for being here. Constance, thank you for joining us.
Yes, good to be here.
So for anyone who doesn't know, Constance is an actor, producer, and author. She's best known for her work in the films Crazy Rich Asians and Hustlers, as well as the TV sitcom Fresh Off the Boat. I heard a woo.
That's my last name. Don't wear it out.
Her new book, Making a Scene, is an intimate and personal collection of essays, and it is out starting October 4th. So, Constance, let's start there.
Yes, sure.
So, as I understand it, this book started out really differently.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. In the acknowledgments, you write, and I'm going to quote you, that it was supposed to be a radical activist tome. So
Yeah.
how did it transform?
It really became what it finally was in the past few years, in the past 3 years. But I started writing it in 2016, around the time of the election. I think we were all feeling so many emotions around that. I was like, I have to put it somewhere. I have to say something. And then I would try to write something smart and fierce, and then I'd read it and I'd be like, this is crap. This is so bad. It's all over the place. But while I was writing, every once in a while, there'd be a little nugget of a personal story. Something as simple as how it feels to make bread. Your first car you had in high school, your first love. And then I was like, let me write about those things. And then it just flowed out of me, and I realized that was the book I needed to write, a personal book. Because in many ways, I think, especially now with, the way it feels like women's bodies are being governed, I almost think thinking of women as real human beings shouldn't be a political statement, but it almost has become that. So yeah, I think by writing a personal book, hopefully it's really just like a more human book.
Yeah, I am curious, you know, at the risk of like over summarizing your book, you do cover, you know, you cover a lot of sensitive subjects, and you talk about your time in Hollywood, you know, how glamorous it can be and how grueling it can also be. And well, you also touched on, you know, working at a bakery, making bread. So when you looked back on the phases of your life and your career, what was the toughest time to revisit and process in writing?
The last essay I wrote, I was actually pretty resistant to write it, was the one about my experience on Fresh Off the Boat. And my publisher really encouraged me to write it, 'cause she was like, that's what people want to hear. And I was like, no, I'm done with that chapter in my life. And then I was like, okay, I'll write it as an exercise. And then I eventually realized it was important to talk about, because I did have a pretty traumatic experience my first couple of years on that show, and nobody knew about it because that show was historic for Asian Americans. And it was the only show on network television in over 20 years to star Asian Americans, and I did not want to sully the reputation of the one show we had representing us. And so therefore I kept my mouth shut for a really long time about a lot of sexual harassment and intimidation that I received the first 2 seasons of the show. Because after the first 2 seasons, once it was a success, once I was no longer scared of losing my job, that's when I was able to start saying no to the harassment, no to the intimidation from this particular producer. And so I thought, you know what? I handled it. Nobody has to know. I don't have to stain this Asian American producer's reputation. I don't have to stain the reputation of the show. But the thing is, bad feelings don't go away just because you will them to. They're inevitably going to come out somewhere. And then when the show was renewed, after they had told me it likely wouldn't be, I made some very profane, reckless tweets that sort of ignited this whole pile-on of hatred towards me, because I just had a hit movie, Crazy Rich Asians. So it looked really bad. Like, from the outside, oh, she thinks she's this big movie star, when really it was just like I wanted to have a fresh slate where I didn't have to start a show with all these memories of abuse. Because every day, because a lot of people knew it was, not a lot, a few people knew it was happening. And to go to work every day and see those people who knew that he was sexually harassing me, being buddy-buddy with him, it felt like a betrayal every time. Sort of like have to see that at work every day. And of course, I don't blame them, because he could fire them too, right? Everybody's looking out for their own job. But it felt like a betrayal. And so I loved everybody on that crew, and I loved working on that show, but it had that history of abuse that it started with. And even though I handled it after 2 years, I was looking forward to a clean slate. So I was a little bit, I feel like those tweets that came out were the emotions I suppressed, that I thought I could will away, coming out in another way. And, you know, it negatively affected my career, but in many ways it positively affected me personally, because it made me take a break from my career, made me go to therapy and understand it, and ultimately come out better because of it. Sorry. I didn't want to cry. But it's like every time I talk about it, I start crying, and every time I'm like, I'm not going to cry this time. But it was really hard to hold it in for so long. So
it's all right. I'll say that when I was reading that chapter, it was making me cry, because some of the figures that you write about, I've seen them be buddy-buddy. And without that context, when everybody saw your tweets, it was, you could very easily
It looked
assume.
real bad.
It looked real bad. I do want to talk more about that, because, the most recent thing that you did in the public eye was return to social media.
Yes.
Also
something that my publisher very much encouraged me to do, and I was very resistant to for a long time.
I'm sure it took 3 years, away. You came back with a statement that was really vulnerable. You wrote about your suicide attempt in 2019. Now, you did just say that your publisher pushed you to return to social media, but why was it important to process publicly?
Well, I think my publisher and I had different goals. After going through a lot of therapy, and I couldn't have done this 3 years ago when I was still very raw and wounded after having come out of the hospital after the suicide attempt, but I had taken 3 years to heal, and so I felt ready and capable, and I felt it was important for me to help people. I think my publisher felt it was important to sell books, but let me just say, I think I'm not knocking this, but I think a lot of people don't read these days, and if the thing that drove me to a suicide attempt was hatred on Twitter, the people I'm trying to reach and to help who are going through what I went through when I had ended up in the hospital, they're probably not out there reading self-help books. They're there scrolling their feeds and feeling so alone and feeling awful. So I realized it was more important to me to help people like that than I was afraid of social media. And the place I'm going to reach them, not with my book, but with my social media statement, was going to be social media. So they're scrolling and they see like, oh, this person who seemingly has it all together, wow, they struggled too. And I wanted to make it clear that, yes, I struggled too, and that there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and that it's okay to ask for help. Because there is, as we often hear, a stigma in the Asian American community on mental health. And I felt like it was important to open up that conversation, not having to do with my book, but just in a forum where I would reach the most people it would help.
Yeah, absolutely. So during your time away from social media, I mean, it's fascinating, when you left social media,
a lot of things happened during that time.
A lot of things happened during that time. You started a family, you had a baby.
I had a kid. I reconciled with my mom, who I hadn't spoken to for 5 years, who's here today. So. A lot of healing.
A lot of healing happened in that time.
I didn't get COVID, still haven't.
Oh.
I feel that makes me very, I feel proud of it.
Yeah, you did just test negative backstage. So
yes.
Yeah, check.
It's like another one. Yeah, got it.
So, it seems like your priorities really changed. I want to know what it was like, how has this semblance of anonymity affected your creative process, your creative endeavors? Because as an actor, you need to observe, but for a couple years there, you were being observed. And yeah, I really refocused on my values, and it's still acting. A big theme of the book is how art is healing, and how acting, since I was a kid, doing community theater was always a place that was safe and a refuge. And then going to Hollywood, where there was all this abuse, and mind you, all this abuse that was happening to me before the Me Too movement. So and since then, I've actually met other Asian actresses who have gone through the same thing with this particular Asian American producer. And it's funny because he treated white and black women with the utmost respect and deference, and reserved his misogyny and power plays for Asian women. But since this was before the Me Too movement, nobody was talking about it, not even to each other. And so, oh my God, I forgot your original question. What was it? I had a point. We'll get there. It was about the anonymity that you experienced.
Oh, yes. So art is healing, right? But when you're an actor, you're sort of there to look at the human experience. But if you're not having a very, if you're sort of removed from the world, it kind of stops that a little bit. And so I think going to the hospital and getting help and realizing there were things that I needed to look at in my life, like how I hadn't spoken to my mother. And a lot of that was because I didn't know how to handle fame. I don't have parents in the industry. I don't have relatives in the industry. There's no class in drama school that prepared me for any of it. So a lot of, and I wasn't a teenager, but I was probably acting like one. Like a lot of teenagers, you sort of take it out on your mom and do that. And I did that, and I'm very sorry for it and continue to be. But, becoming pregnant and talking with her was ultimately really healing. And so I'm very grateful for the experience. And, I don't know if I'm going to stay on social media. I probably think I'm not. But for the time being, I'm there just to make sure that people who need to know that there's help out there so that they know.
Yeah. I'm curious, I want to rewind a little bit to your profile skyrocketed between, I'd say, 2015 to 2018, and the online backlash came in 2019. Mm-hmm. During that time, I mean, what did you do to quiet the noise, if anything?
I think that was the problem. I didn't have a place to quiet the noise. I write about this in one of my essays, is because I was really into doing therapy even before I, quote unquote, became famous. But once I started doing the show, I was working like 60-hour work weeks. That's not a complaint. It's just a description of the hours. And my therapists kind of work 9 to 5. So it's like I didn't have any place or time to have appointments. And she also had like 2 kids and a newborn baby. So I felt really guilty asking her to like take time out of her weekends, which she totally did when she could. But I didn't have that. And I think that's another message I would like to send to young actors, is to recognize, when you're young, or even young people in the professional industries, in like more corporate places, when you're young, you're so hungry and you're like hustling, you're like, I gotta focus, gotta do these things. And I think it's important to understand that your well-being and mental health is important during that time, and to make time for it even amidst the hustle.
Yeah. I asked that because, in the past couple of years, we've seen you back off of social media and then return to projects like The Terminal List. You're making public appearances.
But that was an acting project.
Yes.
I didn't return to social media for that.
Right.
Yeah.
My question is, now as you're going forward, how do you decide what to share about yourself, what not to, when to speak out, when to pull back? What is your North Star in understanding how much your professional and personal lives have to blend together?
I think it's a case-by-case basis, and it's definitely me looking at what's more important. The message I'm trying to get across, or my fear of losing privacy. And there are certain things, like I don't share pictures of my daughter, because even though I would love for the world to know, oh my God, my daughter's the cutest thing in the world, everybody should see it, and of course everybody wants to show off their kid, my priority on her privacy is more important than my joy at how cute she is. So I choose her privacy. But then with the social media statement, I want privacy. I don't want to be on social media, but I want to kind of save lives and encourage people to get help, so that outweighed it. So it's a case-by-case basis. And I think it'll continue to be as social media evolves or devolves. You guys, I'm 40, I'm too old for TikTok, but I'm like, it's nuts.
It's a whole different world.
What's going on? People are frying chicken in NyQuil. Did you know that? This is a TikTok trend. People are eating laundry detergent. I don't get it.
That was fascinating.
But maybe I'm too old for it. Yeah. I don't know.
Well, going off of that, do you think it's possible, just because there seems to be this expectation of accessibility for any public figure, especially in this industry, right? If you're going to stay relevant, you got to share parts of yourself. Especially during the pandemic, when you were receding from social media, we were seeing the backyards of celebrities' homes because that's where the red carpet was.
Yeah.
Do you think it's possible for any public figure today, even on a case-by-case basis, to be only known by their work, to avoid even the possibility of backlash or quote?
I think it's hard. And I think that there actually are producers and studios who look at social media numbers as a hiring mechanism. It's like having 3 million followers on Instagram is way more impressive than having a PhD from Harvard. It's more valuable to them. It really is. So I think, but that's another case of weighing privacy or career. And some people, they want the career more. They want what social media will bring, and they like the outlet of expression, which if it's intuitive to you, it's natural. If it's natural to you to fry your chicken in NyQuil, go for it. Don't, because I don't know the health consequences of that, but
It's not
my. I was never into this. I never got into this because of celebrity. I got into this because I was an emotional kid who was really loud, and theater and acting was the one place where not only was it okay to make a scene and be an emotional kid, it was actually like celebrated. So that's sort of why I got into it, and it continues to be why I pursue it.
Yeah. Well, then to wrap up, going off of that, I wonder, how do you define success today? In your book, you write about the never expecting to lead a sitcom, right? You trained in theater, in classical theater.
Right, yeah. Well, I'm going to quote somebody else, and I think the second part of her quote is the part that I'm always like, that's the key. Maya Angelou said, success is liking what you do and liking how you do it. Because a lot of people like what they do, but they might do it in like a shady, dishonorable way or like whatever. But liking and being proud of how you do it, having integrity in yourself and in your work, that is success. So it doesn't have to do with money or, And that's how I define it. Or I'm not going to take my credit for Maya Angelou's words. She's amazing. But I come back to that a lot. Yeah.
And finally, something I am curious about with your book, just to go all the way back to making a scene, you write about these key moments in your life as if they're scenes from a script.
Some of them, yeah.
Some of them. I was curious about that choice and who you were picturing as your reader. Do you plan on ever performing these scenes?
Oh, no, I don't plan on ever performing them. But, I think I wrote a few of the events in my book as if they were scenes in a play or a screenplay. Because I thought, rather than giving my opinion or feelings on what happened to me, like part of the sexual harassment, if you just say the events and the words that happened, it has a greater effect. Like, for example, my producer, touching my crotch, and then me saying, no, don't do that, finally saying no, and then he got mad, but then he did this other thing where he... Right after he did that, he touched a less provocative place. He grabbed the fat behind my tricep, jiggled it around, and I was like, what are you doing, dude? He goes, oh, no, you have big arms. That means you're strong. Strong women are great. Good for you. If you just look at the words, it's like, oh, he didn't say anything bad. He said strong women are great. Good for you. Patted me on the back. It was a power play. It was a type of. It wasn't cool, but I, instead of saying it wasn't cool, I just said these are the events that happen, and people can draw their own conclusions for it. So that I'm not passing judgment on him. I'm just sort of showing he said these words. Strong women are great. That means you're strong. Good for you.
Good for you.
Good for me, yeah. But yeah, that's why I wrote some of the scenes like that.
Yeah. Constance, thank you so much for sharing today. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap it here today. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, everybody.
Here to explore how AI is changing the meaning of art, please welcome Jason Scott, a software curator in free-range archivist from Internet Archive, and Adrienne LaFrance, executive editor of The Atlantic.
Hello, everyone. Jason, thank you for being with us.
Hello, Adrienne. How you doing?
He always has the best blazers, you probably noticed. So I want to start with a bit, this is going to be fun because we're going to have demonstrations for you all. But first, orient us a bit. When we talk about AI art, what do we even mean? How does it work?
Sure. So what we're calling now AI art, and by the way, it's so fast now, they're now calling it synthetic media. So get on that. But it's the idea of using analysis of deep ranges of images, and not just looking at them as patterns or samples, but actually, connecting their captions and their contexts up against pictures of all sorts, and then synthesizing new versions from all that.
So basically, a giant database of images that can be drawn from to call to mind the thing that you sort of prompt it to make.
Right, and the more you look at, the better, or at least the more interesting, I guess it gets. So the one that a lot of people are using right now is a set of 5 billion text and image, caption collections.
And why is it exploding now? I mean, it seems like various forms of machine learning and AI have really accelerated in recent years in particular.
So they let it out of the lab and let regular people play with the toys. If you go inside a lot of companies, everything from food to medicine to everywhere else, you can go down and go, wow, this is amazing. And they're like, yeah, and you have to sign 10 NDAs and you can't tell anybody this is going on down here. And it's clear that across the AI companies or the companies that are doing this, they're all kind of positioning to figure out like where are we going to be. And some are taking the model of, well, let everyone play with it. Now it's part of the world.
Well, and so of course my mind goes to creative industries, but when you think about the implications for this sort of technology, just sort of give us an overview of how this is going to change the way we interact, not with art, with whatever other industries come to mind.
So first, I just want to say, okay, so even though I'm a guy in a top hat who looks like he sells Dr. Scott's tonsorial operatic fluid, I do want to say, in fact, I'm not going to give you an affiliate link. I'm not going to tell you to go to one company. I'm not going to tell you I'm being brought by anybody. I'm just the free-range archivist at a wonderful place called the Internet Archive, archive.org. Some of you know it as the Wayback Machine. And it is, oh yeah. Some people think I made it. No, a man named Brewster Kahle co-founded it with money that he got from selling his company, and his dream after becoming fabulously rich was, I could become a librarian now. And he did it pretty well. And so my job within that company is just kind of to see what's neat out there. And that's how I ended up with this kind of a situation. And so I've actually forgotten the question. I was so happy to talk about my company.
No, it's great. And the Internet Archive is truly amazing. We were going to talk about the implications. So you imagine, I think of at the Atlantic, we have human artists making art. I'm sure they might have strong feelings about the idea of machines making art. What other industries would be potentially affected?
Sure. So sometimes it's easy to kind of anthropomorphize this equipment. I see people do that. They're like, it's very angry, or it's not, it doesn't understand this. And that's,
or it's creepy.
Or it's creepy, and it's just very new and what's going on. But the idea of doing deep analysis of wide ranges of culture, observation, pieces of media, this is the flip side to digitizing and putting everything online. Now machines are becoming more and more capable of doing analysis against images, text, music, movies. We're going to see it go in a whole range against medicine, where you can now afford to blast a bunch of light readings or deep readings by a machine against a whole bunch of concepts and see what comes out. So for one thing, there are experimental search engines out there that you can play with, and you can say things like, I need to see 3 people around a laptop. And previously, it would have to be 3 people and a laptop, but it actually is starting to make matches of just where there's 3 people in the room, or being able to say, can I see everything where somebody in a car is sad? And it kind of figures it out. And the weirder and more creative you get with this toy, the more fun it gets. I see a future where you'll be able to say, could I read a book from the 1930s? That's out there. Can I find a book where it's got a happy ending and it takes place in Boston? Or can I have something where they fell in love but they're not in love at the end? And it'll start to figure that out, which means, then it's on us to go, well, that's nice, but what are we going to use to that benefit? Are we going to use it to learn and research and share? Or are we just going to go neat and move on to the next shiny thing?
I have more questions, but I think now would be a good time to start showing people what we mean. Do you have...
I have some examples of things that I did. I was given access to one of the features, one of the tests, and I had a lot of fun with it. And I don't have my clicker, but here comes the best part of everything, which is the staff. Thank you. So this is detailed blueprints on how to build a beagle. This is...
and just to orient people, so these are prompts that you gave to the model, and this is what came out of it.
Oh, yeah. For the people who don't know how this whole game works, and it's pretty kind of weird, you usually type in some sort of a line to say, I'm looking for something like this, and then it creates that, and then people will get more and more detailed because they're trying to push it. But think of it less as like programming than saying to somebody, yeah, could you go out there and dance like you're happy, and your kid was just just born, and you watch what happens. So it's kind of amorphous. This is a lion using a laptop in the style of a old tapestry. This is Santa Claus riding a motorcycle in the style of 1970s Kodachrome. This is Godzilla at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And this
He looks happy.
He does look pretty happy for it, doesn't it? This is a crayon drawing of a labor action. These are bears doing podcasts. This is GoPro footage of the D-Day landing. And of course, a whole bunch of other ones, and just kind of crazy, different kinds of things I try. For instance, give me an alternative band working at a diner, or give me a father who is steampunk consoling his steampunk son. And the third one is a FedEx truck at night in a forest eating packages. And so, I want to just share, this is one I did, where it's just me playing with one of the systems, where I just always have this dream about a boat that flies in the sky over a forest, and it did a pretty good job of it. And this is not synthetic. This is my mother, who passed away in 2020. This is Elaine Sadovsky. This is trees around a pond in springtime. And so this was my attempt to get that as well, using the same kind of prompts. So anyway, yeah, so that's me. I'm always playing with it. And the reason you're hearing all those strange kind of prompts from me is because I kind of want to understand, what are these systems seeing? What are they doing, right? Like if you're, right now, it's so easy as a parlor game to say, like, yeah, draw, I don't know, a cell phone, but draw it as if it was done as a Roman Greek statue. And that's you kind of slamming against this. But what about doing a bittersweet sky, or trying to draw like a concerned highway? What does it see? You know what I mean?
What does this suggest to you about the nature of art? I mean, this gets to be sort of an existential question, but is it still human-made art in the way that we think of it? And should we be bothered by that? I mean, art, we use all sorts of tools to make art.
So everyone is super entitled to their own opinion. Do not consider me anything, right?
I want to know what you think.
All I can say is I did drawings as a zine in my teens. I was a street caricaturist. My mother was a painter. My father does painting. My brother's a landscape artist. We come from trying to convince and do great things with the world. And coming from that point of view, I am no more scared of this than I am of the fill tool, or of
like in Photoshop.
Yeah, or the clone brush, which is another situation where you can play with it. Everything has a potential to be used as a weapon. Imagery, words, music, text. We do this as people, but we also see an opportunity here for people who never knew that they had access to art. People who don't have the time. People who are they want to be they have a creative expression, and I can almost hear the gears crack and start moving again when I go to somebody who I know, and I'm like, could you give me something to draw? And they do it, and they see how it goes, and I can't get angry at that particular toy. But I won't pretend that this toy will stay in its own way neutral, or even is neutral now.
And it's interesting you mentioned dreams. I was talking to a colleague about these sorts of tools the other week, actually, and we were really compelled by the idea of being able to visualize dreams, because it's something that otherwise only you see, and maybe you can't remember very well anyway. What are the other sorts of things? I mean, fiction comes to mind. Can you think of other things that we can imagine but don't normally get to visualize?
A lot of it for people, believe it or not, is like, sometimes it's just, okay, for me personally, I love telling these AIs to draw exquisite lattice work, using phrases like exquisite or rare, or giving me leather with gold inlay on a toaster or something else, and watching it kind of move into that world and design things in seconds that aren't perfect, but
okay, so
are fun.
I'm cutting you off only because we're short on time.
All right, let's do it.
We're gonna experiment, which is always dangerous. You're never supposed to do stuff in real time, so hopefully this is not going to be embarrassing. But I have some prompts for you.
And I want to say, this is DALL-E. There's other ones called Midjourney.
Right.
There are many others.
Dream Studio. Yeah.
Just think of it as like early web servers or early web browsers. There's a bunch of companies with various people funding them or doing things their own way. At this point in life, I think most people know, research what you're playing with. Look at what's paying for it. Decide how you feel about it. In this particular case, I'm using it because it's so easy for us to do right here.
Okay, great.
So that's a nervous top man in a top hat on stage while stagehands dance nearby. I also wanted to ask it to design me some alternative Adrienne LaFrance's.
Oh, wow.
Now, I'm just saying, while we're bundling,
competitive.
While we're bundling you into the limo, one of these has to go out and be seen by the crowd. Okay?
Let's do. Wait. Let me do some. Let's do people at the Atlantic Festival having a great time in the style of Edward Hopper.
Having a great time. So just to say before we do it, I don't know what it's going to do with Atlantic Festival as a concept, but
Let's find out.
and I will say that we're going to do that. But as an artist, you will also sometimes have to translate your work, and I would go, at a big conference.
Okay.
But let's find out. I press the button, the thing goes off. It's looking at piles and piles of image pairs, creating kind of synthesized images around that, and it got very hung up on Atlantic and festival. So there we go. This guy right here, he's having the time of his life. All right, give me another one.
Okay, how about the moment the dinosaurs went extinct, illustrated in Art Nouveau style?
Is that looking like my most biggest problem is typing on a cold stage with there we go. Oh, come on. There we go. Dino. Oh boy. This is actually an actual nightmare of mine.
No, you're doing great.
So
we'll do that next.
Yeah, we'll do that
Jason
next.
Scott's nightmares.
Jason Scott's nightmares. Oh my goodness. So like the excitement of being able to come up with these different pieces of work that you do, and I mean just to if I say, well, what
let me do one more, and then I'm sorry, I wish we could do this all day, but Chewbacca on the cover of the Atlantic magazine in the style of Renaissance painting.
Okay.
I like the dinosaurs, though.
I love the dinosaurs. Well, that's the other thing is I think in the style of Renaissance, I just want to say, like, the most shocking thing for people when they first encounter it is the depth and kind of intricacy that you would normally think would take a long time. That's, I think, part of what draws me in is to go, it's not just going to go, oh, I did this and applied a filter. Like it's
very serious.
Yeah, no, Chewbacca has some very strong ideals on the world stage.
Indeed.
And so when I say to people, like this is one where a friend wanted a turtle surfing on a sea of macaroni and cheese, and it did a pretty good job. And we see like the ability to do everything from intricate pen and ink drawings to cartoons to people are using it now already to literally using these things now to make all sorts of textures for video games. They are making art along a theme that they need to cover an entire wall of a coffee shop with. They're using it to illustrate their works. People are trying all sorts of things with this technology and are excited by it. But it's also like sampling. It is exactly going to have that level of, we already have, there's already services to go, is any of my stuff on any of my services being used for the data set?
Right.
Is,
there
all
are the biases that can come with this
there are some communities, and personally I understand this, who are saying we don't want any of that here.
Right.
Because they're going to get flooded. In other words, like if everybody else is producing art at the rate of 1 or twice a week, and suddenly you get someone who can do 100 in a day, even if they're fun and good, you're never going to know what's what.
Well, it raises so many questions. It's great fun. We're in the infancy of all of this, and so I'm sure we'll revisit it, certainly in the pages of The Atlantic. And Jason, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you all.
to discuss how evangelicals are shaping American politics. Please welcome Ed Stetzer, Executive Director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, and Tim Alberta, a staff writer with The Atlantic.
Good afternoon. Wow, what a lively audience. How's everybody doing? Good.
All right.
Thanks for having us. Ed?
Glad to be here.
Good to see you. I wanted to start with this, Ed. You know, the title, How Evangelicals Are Shaping American Politics. It strikes me that perhaps the crisis at present for Christians like us is not how evangelicals are shaping American politics, but how American politics are shaping evangelicals. Amen. Can I get an amen?
The one person.
We can be
Enthusiastic person
Pentecostals
out
for the
there.
day.
Everybody should be a Pentecostal for a day.
At least for one day. Talk to me about that. The degree to which the Christian identity has become so wrapped up, perhaps too wrapped up, in the American political identity.
Yeah, and it's problematic when a faith is tied specifically to a political system. Evangelicals don't generally define themselves politically. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying there are not correlations and patterns and polls that talk about how evangelicals, particularly white evangelicals, tend to vote. But evangelicals generally see themselves as that it being a religious description, not a political description, that it has to do with a certain way of approaching the Bible, has to do with a certain way of believing about conversion. One of the central things of evangelicalism is that people receive by grace and through faith the good news of the gospel and actually become Christians. So that's what evangelical leaders, by and large, wish we would be known for, is we would be known for a commitment to Scripture, for a commitment to sharing the gospel, to doing good in Jesus' name, and more. But increasingly, and many of us find it problematic, it has been seen as a political identification in ways that's very different from the rest of the world. That's not how people see evangelicals in the UK, or for that matter, in other countries around the world. Some countries, they do. Right now, the campaign in Brazil very much feels similar to the way evangelicals are talked about here politically. But by and large, it has to do with a faith tradition of what we actually call conversionary Protestantism. That's how evangelicals would like to be defined. But we're not having a conversation about that. The word politics is on the screen behind us.
I'm so glad that you brought up the rest of the world. It's fascinating to me whenever I've had conversations with anyone in the missions field, which is often. And I grow up in my church participating in missions. We support missionaries. This is a world that I'm pretty familiar with. And time after time, these conversations come back to a place where, you know, the Chinese evangelical movement is thriving, healthy. The Korean, everywhere else, it seems to be an American problem, a uniquely American problem. What is it about the American identity that seems to create this tension as it relates to evangelicalism and the modern evangelical movement?
Yeah, and I think it's complicated is where we'd start. And it's not uniquely American, but it's like I mentioned, Brazil and some other places where that's the case. But it is overwhelmingly present in our conversation. So I'm the regional director for what's called Lausanne. It's a global missions movement, most representative gathering of evangelical Christians in Cape Town in 2010, and again coming up in Seoul, Korea. And so I lead the North American region, and I meet with the other regional leaders, and they're just flummoxed. I mean, what's going on? Can you explain to us American evangelicalism? And often the answer is well, no, I really don't always understand what's going on. Now, of course, our region, the way it's laid out is Central and South America are together in a region. So our region's U.S. and Canada. Even in Canada, it's different. You know, my wife's Canadian, my daughters are dual citizens. So even Canadian evangelicalism is different than American evangelicalism. But in the world, 3 nations have sort of resisted secularization at a higher level: Poland, Ireland, and the United States. And so since they resisted secularization, they ended up with different religious background. You know, Poland's obviously decidedly more Catholic. But the United States, it was Protestant, and then increasingly, as mainline Protestantism has declined and has become less and less of a social force, it's evangelicalism. So today, 65 million people attend church weekly. They report they attend church weekly in the United States. 20 million people a little more than 20 million people say yearly, they at some point yearly go to a NBA game. We were talking about the Pistons before we came in here. But 65 million people weekly, yet most people know far more about the Pistons than they do about the Presbyterians. So it's a very significant movement. Of the 65 million who regularly attend, about half of them consider themselves evangelical or born again, so using kind of Pew's description. That means about half the regular church attenders in America, so over 30 million people. So that's a significant group of people who have tended to develop together certain values and beliefs that have tended to therefore align with certain political parties, and so thus you see 80+% of white evangelicals voting for President Trump in the most recent election.
I want to come back to some of the numbers a minute ago as far as church membership, church growth, lack thereof. But you mentioned the 81% of white evangelicals number, which I think felt like a bit of a watershed. We'd been, certainly I had been in over a decade of covering Republican politics. Evangelicalism was always sort of a central element of the story. Right. And then it became, it certainly seemed to become more of a dominant element in the story. And when you talk with American evangelical leaders, whether they supported Trump or didn't support Trump, some would argue that really the rise of Trump is what sort of created this fracture. And I'm not sure that I agree with that. I'm not sure you do either. It's almost too easy sometimes to lay all of this at the doorstep of 2016. Sure. But certainly it's intensified. COVID, vaccines, masking, churches breaking apart everywhere. Right. But how far back do you really trace it?
I think it's a good question. There's an article in The Atlantic David Brooks wrote a few years ago, America is having a moral convulsion. I found it really helpful. I use it when I teach on this topic. And I think we're in the midst of, I don't think it's just moral, I think it's cultural. I think we're in the midst of a cultural convulsion that happened it's been happening for a while. And I think 2016 was certainly part of that. But, 2016 is, the rise of nationalism in other places around the world as well. I mean, elections in Quebec in 2018, and we can go on and see some of these things. So it's not just a uniquely American experience. I think President Trump, in, largely winning 2016, people debate this, and you have written on this much more than I have, but, uniting rural America with some of those three key Rust Belt states and evangelicals became a winning coalition. And so when you have a winning coalition like that, evangelicals are disproportionately represented in that coalition. And also, too, there's a religious element that, again, I think becomes problematic when a faith becomes predominantly identified with one party. I think evangelical Christians should speak, the term we'd use internally is prophetically to both parties. Instead of being captured, becomes part of the challenge. But I think the disproportionate influence came because of that alliance. And that those three constituents who probably led to the win in 2016, and then I think that was cemented. I think you found people actually who were suspicious of Trump in 2016 moved towards him when, for example, he appointed Supreme Court justices, or he would become, he would speak at the March for Life, things of that sort. People who were suspicious, thinking he wasn't honest about those things, actually moved towards him. So many evangelicals I know who didn't vote for him in 2016 did vote for him in 2020.
There was also, we were just chatting about this backstage, but probably the single most important phenomenon I've observed in the evangelical world was in the aftermath of Trump's election. There seemed to be something that I'd never really observed before in American politics as far as the relationship between an electorate and an elected official. Attacks on Trump's character, were no longer just attacks on Trump and Trump's character. They were attacks on his supporters, his evangelical supporters, and on their character. And that seemed to drive a lot of these folks deeper and deeper and deeper into the Trump camp, even if they were, at least privately, really struggling with how to reconcile his behaviors, his rhetoric, with their faith and what it teaches.
Yeah, and I think, to be fair, I think a lot of evangelicals who did vote for President Trump would say that there were actually two people in the election, and they made the choice on the basis of that. They voted without enthusiasm or more. However, that doesn't mean everybody. And, when, for me, the full-throated endorsement, the full enthusiasm, defend him, almost no matter what, became problematic. And for me, that's where I think it caused and causes a blur to people to say, what do you actually stand for? But in answer to your particular question, I think that there was a poll that PRRI did, and the poll asked the question before the 2016 primaries, Are you concerned that, and I'm paraphrasing, that the private life of public officials is of concern for you? And evangelicals ranked highest. They were the highest group who was concerned. I think it was white evangelicals in this context were the highest group concerned about the private life of public officials, and they were probably thinking of Bill Clinton. After 2016, or up until I'm trying to remember. I think it was actually before the election because I wrote about this. After Trump became the candidate, they flipped completely and became the group with the lowest concern about the private life of public officials. And so for me, I'm of the view that people that I love and deeply care for and respect may have made a decision different than me and who they voted for president. But my concern is when you change your beliefs about morality and the character of officials in order to do something, I think ultimately that price is too high to pay.
And the price, let's be clear, it comes at the expense of the witness. It comes at the expense, in some cases, the erosion of the credibility of the church is, and this can be a circular conversation in some sense, depending on the pastor, the church leader that you're speaking with. But I've had conversations with pastors, I'm sure you have as well, around the country, where they've said, listen, we are now perceived to be a Republican church, and therefore we can no longer evangelize. We can no longer do the thing that we're supposed to be doing here because of that perception. It's become so damaging. And I just wonder if we're through the looking glass here, or if you see a path back from that.
Well, let me say that I do think that I share that concern. I mean, I've written on this extensively about the credibility of Christian witness being impacted by multiple things that you've written on, extremism, other things as well. I would also say, too, that we live in a world where many of the beliefs that evangelicals have that come from what they would see as rooted in their understanding of Scripture are expressed in political ways. And so, therefore, you can't view everything through the lens of witness. However, as someone who's deeply concerned about that, my PhD is in a field called mission or missions, is I teach Christians to engage their culture so they might share the good news of the gospel. I am concerned about that. And I would say that the price was too high. I would also say that I didn't persuade a lot of people on that idea. So just keep that in mind as people listen. I did not win that argument. But I would say that Christians can and should speak up around issues in our culture that are unpopular, but are the right thing to speak up about and speak up on. And Christians have historically done that. People like William Wilberforce, who spoke out and pushed against the slave trade and more when it wasn't popular, right? People like Martin Luther King Jr., who through and in the church space said and mobilized Christians for a different and a better way. So Christians have always engaged public endeavors, even public policy, rooted in their faith. And as our culture has moved away from some of those values, it does make it more challenging. I think ultimately that it becomes an unforced error when in doing so they overlook character issues, or they join in cruelty, or they join in approaches that ultimately I think undermine the good news of the gospel. I mean, I think the good news of the gospel is Jesus came serving the hurting and saving the lost. The world doesn't talk so much about the saving the lost part, but that's deeply important to evangelicals. But also came serving the hurting. I think I would like us to be known more for that, also recognizing that we live in a world where some of the conclusions we come from our understanding of Scripture puts us at odds with prevailing culture.
If there were a handful of these white evangelical Trump supporters in the audience or on stage with us, some of them would surely say that in rationalizing their support, justifying their voting behaviors, that they feel under siege from the culture, that they feel marginalized, that they feel condescended to, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, it is that feeling that justifies the pursuit of political power to combat it and to sort of regain some sort of cultural high ground. And obviously, taken to its natural, logical conclusion, this can become an impediment to evangelizing. It can continue to erode the credibility of the church. And I wonder, again, specifically in the American context, where the line is, because now barely a day goes by without seeing the term Christian nationalism trending on Twitter. And you have elected officials in the Republican Party who are speaking openly at these conferences, talking about the need to restore a Christian nation, even flirting with downright theocratic language. So is this sense of being under siege, A, do you share any of that sentiment? Do you believe that it's legitimate to a degree? And B, how do we keep that from spilling over into what has clearly become an unhealthy obsession with political power?
So under siege is probably not the language that I would choose. But what I would say is I think there would be the widespread idea that evangelicals are often looked askance, kind of seen themselves as pushed to the side. I don't think that there are many mainstream evangelical voices who would be, welcome in the pages of different publications and more. Now, there are exceptions. We have exceptions to that. I think we need more, not less of that. Again, if it's true, depending on how you count, if 25 to 30 to 33% of Americans are evangelicals, I don't know that that's representative in our public discourse. And part of that may be because, people don't like the values or the views, and I get that. But so that being said, I would say the reality is that evangelical Christians are often, for example, the culture war is a big part of that conversation. And I think, warring at people is not the way you reach people. You can't hate a people and reach a people at the same time. At the same time, much of this has come to Christian institutions like Wheaton College, where I serve. So the question becomes can we function according to our beliefs in our Christian worldview on this campus among people who've agreed to walk together in these covenant communities? And increasingly, people in the culture would say, no, we don't want you to, and here's how we would push against that. So what I would say is, yes, there is a sense that Christians feel marginalized. I remember Nicholas Kristof's article in the New York Times when he talked about a physician who was serving in Africa, and he said, every time I go to Africa, to the places where maybe the hardest places are, where disease is rampant and poverty is rampant, what I see is evangelicals, often from America, doing good in the name of Jesus. I don't think people feel that is represented. So you called me not that long ago and said, hey, you want to come do this? Because I think you called all the other evangelicals. No one was willing to come on this stage with you. So I was like number 47 on the list. But, I was, as I mentioned to you, I was actually last night in Peoria, Illinois. I'm guessing not a lot of us have been to Peoria, Illinois. My first time there. Well, there you go. One person from Peoria, Illinois. The odds of that are very significantly low, just the number of people in the room. And I was gathered there and with 500 evangelical pastors and leaders. And I was speaking. I actually wore their bracelet today. It's from Peoria Rescue Ministries. And, I told them that I was going to be here today. I said, you can watch it online. I said, I might even mention you. Because so often those are the evangelicals that I know, and I wish that all of you would know better. Now, they're not the only thing. I am not, most of you wouldn't know me from Adam, I am not one who's unaware of the challenges of evangelicals. I've written on them in multiple times in USA Today, CNN, Washington Post. I've spoken into those issues. But I do think evangelicals wish they were more fairly represented in the conversation and in the context where they are. And I would say, I remember a few years ago, I'll use, when Chick-fil-A, you can't have a conversation about evangelicalism without mentioning Chick-fil-A. When Chick-fil-A, CNN headline, top right corner said, Chick-fil-A stops giving to anti-LGBTQ organizations. Okay, so I clicked on the article. And the two organizations they referred to were the Fellowship of Christian Athletes and the Salvation Army. And I emailed at that time, Daniel Burke is his name, he was the CNN religion reporter, and I said, Daniel, do you really think that it is fair that you have summed up the work and ministry of the Salvation Army in a headline in CNN as an anti-LGBTQ organization? And so he wrote an article, quoted, I think, my email, or we talked about it or something. So what I would say is, the reality is, I wish I could say that if we evangelicals just cared for the poor and showed and shared the love of Jesus to everyone, that the culture would just say, you're just great. But the Salvation Army would tell you, no, that's not true either. Because the Salvation Army is largely driven by caring for the poor, the homeless, those without, and sharing their faith and doing so within the framework of their understanding of the scriptures. And they haven't gotten to pass in the midst of some of the culture wars.
Well, and so two things can be true at once, of course. So some of what you're saying is fair, no question about it. On the other hand, you do have individuals who seem to, and any movement is naturally defined by some of its highest profile figures.
For sure.
Last week, Al Mohler was in the news. Al Mohler, for those of you who don't know, is the president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, one of the nation's most recognizable evangelical leaders. And he gave a speech in which he said that if Christians vote wrongly, that they are therefore unfaithful to God.
Right.
And the day after he gave that speech, I talked to a close friend of his who said it was the saddest day of his life.
Yeah.
And I wonder what your reaction was when you heard him say that.
Well, I assume I know what he's saying when they said vote wrongly. And what I would say is vote according to your conscience, and that's not voting wrongly. And I would say that in the space of a white evangelical space, for most of the people in that space, there would be some commonalities how they vote, not everybody. But, just a couple weeks ago, I was in Atlanta preaching at a church, Bishop Dale Bronner, at Word of Faith Family Church. It's a African-American charismatic church. And I'm guessing that some of them voted differently than other friends that I had. And I would say that people need to make their calculus upon how might I vote according to my values that I think will accomplish the most for the common good. In the Old Testament, the book of Jeremiah, it says to pray for the welfare of the city, work for the welfare of the city. And part of that is we vote. And so I would say that Christians should vote according to their conscience and not seek to impose on others what their conscience must dictate. So his comments were widely pushed back on, and you saw that as well. You talked to people as well. I would not and have not phrased it that way. I think people should vote according to their best understanding of what would advance the common good. And for the Christian, part of the common good is to advance the kind of world where we would think the Lord would want it more to be like and to resemble.
And I think, of course, inherent to this conversation about those comments and others is, again, bringing it back full circle, this sense of American identity,
right,
and the idea that, for some, that the kingdom is here.
Right.
And I think you and I are among those who believe that our citizenship ultimately resides elsewhere.
Sure.
And I want to close on this note. I was having a conversation with a pastor a couple of years ago, sort of COVID raging, post-January 6th, his church is falling apart, and he was broken. And this is an extremely talented man who was watching his church fall apart in real time. Mm-hmm. And I said, what do you think is the biggest problem in your church right now and for the church, capital C? How would you summarize it? And he thought for a minute and he said, I think a lot of these people love America more than they love Jesus. And I'm just wondering, is there a way out of that you see? Because I know you have these same conversations all the time, and I know that perhaps it is not a totally uniquely American problem, but it feels like a predominantly American problem.
It's much more so here than in most places.
And we're wrestling with this. How can we put this genie back in the bottle? Yeah. Is there a way to decouple the flag from the cross and to make sure that our priorities as Christians are in the right place?
I wish I could remember the number off the top of my head. I used to run a firm called Lifeway Research, and since I left, they did a poll, and they asked pastors, I'm concerned, agree or disagree, that sometimes people in my church love America more than they love, I forget what it was, God or the kingdom of God or something like that. And it was over a majority of people felt that way. So I think that is a rightful concern. And I think, to use some insider language, I think that's where the need for discipleship. For, you mentioned the kingdom, Philippians 3:20, we're not citizens of this world. The kingdom of God has broken into the world when the king came, when Jesus came. So if that's the case, there's a new way of living. There's a new life in Christ that's then lived out. And so what I would say is right now, the discipleship hasn't held in the last few years. Far too many American Christians are being discipled by their cable news choices. They're being spiritually shaped by talk radio. They're being spiritually shaped by their social media. And so I think ultimately what has to happen is a greater focus for me on the teachings of Jesus, the teachings of the Bible, ultimately calling people to live a different kind of life. So I think if we look back 5 years from now, I think we're in the midst, again, to quote that article that David Brooks wrote in the Atlantic, we're in the midst of this moral convulsion, this cultural convulsion. They tend to come every 60 years. They tend to last a few years. This is not the first time that we have had this kind of evangelical convulsing, though. There's a book by J.C. Ryle called Knots Untied. And it's about evangelicals wrestling and conflict and all that kind of stuff. And it was written in 1898. So this is a pattern that we have and that we go through. But I think ultimately a greater focus on who Jesus is and calling women and men to follow him and join him on mission. So those 500 folks I talked to last night, I pointed them to John 20:21. It says, Jesus speaks and says, as the Father has sent me, even so send I you. And I asked them to be the kind of people in the world who said what Isaiah said in the Hebrew scriptures in the Old Testament. He said, here I am, send me. I'm trying to encourage Christians to be the kind of people in the midst of a broken and hurting world who show and share the love of Jesus and who say, here I am, send me.
Well, Ed, thank you. I wish we could, there's so much more to get into, and I have a feeling that we'll have many more conversations about this, but I want to thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And now for a session produced by our underwriter, the Boston Consulting Group, a conversation exploring trust in government. Please welcome Troy Thomas, Managing Director and Partner at the Boston Consulting Group, with Alice McCown, the publisher of The Atlantic.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us today, Troy. Today we are talking about trust in government. So over the last few decades, we've really seen public opinion erode when it comes to our elected leaders. And I think with the midterms coming up, we have a unique opportunity to revisit that and discuss. So I'm putting it to you. Why do you think trust matters?
Well, it's a fantastic topic. I notice I'm on a couch and I do have some trust issues.
You can lie down.
So
You can talk to me.
I'm glad it's on the agenda, and it's nice to be here with you, Alice. I'll just go ahead and spill my, pour out my soul.
We're all listening.
Obviously trust matters because you need it to get big things done. You need the cooperation of the citizenry with the government to tackle big issues like emergency response and fighting pandemics. But I mean, let's be honest. I mean, distrust is in our DNA. I'm reminded of the very first line of the very first Federalist paper written by Alexander Hamilton. You can never go wrong with a Hamilton shout out, particularly when it's playing at the Kennedy Center, where he wrote the very first line of the Federalist paper was about our experience, our unequivocal experience with the inefficiency of federal government. Distrust is part of our origin story, and it can actually be quite productive when it's used to hold the government accountable. That said, there's all kinds of paradoxes that come from this. One of them is that trust in the government is at an all-time low, and yet the same research, often done by the Pew Foundation, will show that the people think, American citizens think the government's not doing enough on the issues that matter to them, like healthcare infrastructure. Or Congress is always at the bottom of that list, and yet we re-elect our representatives at a rate of over 70% for the last 60 years. So trust in the abstract is low, but when you de-average it, it tells a different story.
It's interesting. So BCG has joined us last year. We talked a lot about this last year. So it feels like a very full circle moment. I guess I'm curious, do you feel like any strides have been made sort of in the past year?
Well, I think there's maybe two levels to answer that question. I spent 30 years in government, so one way to think about this is, in my mind, every day there are over 2 million strides being taken because there are over 2 million federal workers that wake up every day. They used to walk out their door, maybe now they just go to their computer with just their shirts and ties on. And they wake up every day trying to do right by the American citizen. Now, if what we're really asking about is administrations and elected leaders, I think the story there is more uneven because there are those that intentionally try and undermine the legitimacy of our institutions. But we also know that every administration, this one, the previous administration, work really hard to do things to earn trust. They put a lot into our experience in interacting with the government and getting benefits, our customer experience, if you will. They promote transparency and accountability. It's just a really uneven track record.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting. So what should the goal of the government be as it relates to building trust, or what are ways that you think they can achieve it?
Well, I think it's an uphill battle. in part, given that the distrust, it's sort of in our system. And in fact, no one runs for office saying, I can't wait to come to Washington, D.C. and be part of the federal government. They're always basically like, I'm an outsider, right? But when you get here, I mean, the first thing you can do is just perform, like get results on the things that matter. Then hold people accountable when they don't. Make it super transparent to everybody. And then I think when you're successful, you should just like over communicate. I'm reminded like this week, earlier this week, the Partnership for Public Service hosted the Sammys. It's kind of like the Oscars for bureaucrats. It's the Samuel J. Hyman Public Service Awards. And it's a terrific event. It celebrates public servants that do amazing things. I lead our space business at BCG, so I was particularly delighted that the Federal Employee of the Year that was recognized, Mr. Gregory Robinson, he was the person that basically helped recover the James Webb Telescope program, get it launched, get it on orbit, and like all of us are being stunned every day by what's coming off of that. Like there are amazing things that the government is doing that warrants our trust. We just have to talk about it more.
Yeah, just tell those stories more.
Absolutely. The Atlantic does that.
One of the most important inflection points in building trust is during transitions. And I know BCG does a lot of this work on transitions, particularly with the Partnership for Public Service. So in your time with working with this organization, what have you seen or what aha moments have there been?
Well, we're coming, up on 2 years since a very challenging transition. Before this current role, I spent 30 years in government, most of it in the Air Force, but also worked on several transitions. So I was in the Obama White House supporting the transition to the incoming Trump administration. And there's several things I've learned in working with the center, but my biggest aha moment just comes more in general, and that is you can't take this for granted. The hallmark of democracy is that transfer of power. And we sort of take it for granted. We've had other moments in history where it's taken a while for us to sort out who it was going to be, but it happened in a peaceful way. And so, but the other thing I take away from it is the institutions held up. And I'm reminded of, again, as those public servants is, while all this turmoil is going on, there are these 2 million people that are showing up, making sure the trains run on time, protecting our airspace, operating, managing our healthcare systems, and we can really rely on them during these difficult moments.
That's great to hear. That's great. From what I understand, the public sector is no stranger to the best places to work in the federal government report. Can you tell me a little bit about this report and again, any key learnings from that report?
Yeah, I feel like I'm here advertising the Partnership for Public Service, but we're happy to be their partner. They do a lot of amazing things. So another one of their initiatives that we participate in is this thing called the best place to work in the federal government. And what does this have to do with trust, right? This is a ranking of employee satisfaction or employee engagement, and it's data driven, a lot of analytics around it. But the different agencies get rated. NASA's always at the top. I won't say who's always at the bottom. One of the things, there's several things that you learn from being able to look at these agencies over time, and also you can compare them to employee satisfaction and engagement in the private sector. What we know is an engaged employee, if you're someone that would say to someone you should work where I work, then you're probably an engaged employee. And you get more productivity, you get better outcomes. And two things really come out to me that matter a lot, and they have a lot to do with trust. The first one is leadership really matters. You can see agencies where the morale is low and the productivity is low. A new leader comes in and they soar to the top of the charts. What are they doing? They're basically, the unlock here is they're investing in the people, and they're trusting the career civil servants do their job and empowering them to do it and investing in them. The second unlock is there's one dimension in this survey, you see it every year, where the public sector blows away the private sector. And it has to do with employees' willingness to go above and beyond for the mission. Wow. There's this thing right now called quiet quitting. Yeah. I'm sure it goes on in the federal government, but probably less, because what you have with federal employees is they show up, and if they're asked to do the extraordinary for the mission, for the citizens, they do it. And that's a real strength that we can build on as we try and create more trust in the system.
That's a great way to end and incredibly hopeful. So thank you so much, Troy. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alice.
Now for a conversation about the state of storytelling, please welcome author Tom Perrotta and Atlantic staff writer Sophie Gilbert.
Excited to be talking with you about Tracy Flick and what someone pointed out is her spiritual home of Washington, D.C.
Where she wants to be.
I know. I think we'll jump right in. What made you want to revisit Tracy Flick at this moment?
Well, I had the very unusual experience as a writer of creating a character who really took on a life of her own in two different ways. The first was that Tracy existed on the page, and then Reese Witherspoon played her in the wonderful movie in 1999. And she was so good that I think she created an archetype that made its way into the culture. And so almost every ambitious national politician who was a woman was compared to Tracy Flick, and not always nicely. Tracy got this reputation for being abrasive and unpleasant, and I think particularly those attributes were applied to Hillary Clinton. She became a kind of a Tracy Flick figure. There were internet memes that had Hillary as Tracy and Obama as Paul, the golden boy who gets to float above the fray while she has to do the gritty work of politics. And then after that, I think some critics rediscovered Tracy and said, wait a second, Tracy's not a villain. Yeah. In fact, Tracy is a victim, and it was a kind of a feminist revision of Tracy, which was interesting because I don't think Tracy herself as a character would like the idea that she was a victim. She really wanted to feel powerful and feel like somebody who could win. And, so that was, she was in the air, and she belonged to the culture more than to me. But then Me Too happened, and anyone who's read the book Election or seen the movie knows that Tracy had a sexual relationship with a teacher, and she was very defiant about it in the book. And I wondered as a writer if I had been fair to her, and I went back and reread the book, and I just wanted, I know that I think about issues of consent and power relationships very differently now than I thought about them in the 1990s, and I wondered if Tracy did too. And that was part of what Tracy Flick Can't Win was about, was a middle-aged Tracy Flick looking back at her life and thinking about things that happened to her in high school and how they had, affected her life in the long run.
You talked about the sort of duality of Tracy. She exists in the book and she exists in the movie. But the movie, I think, was optioned before the book was even out. Is that right?
Yeah. So Election is kind of my Cinderella story because it was, I'd written 3 books that weren't published, and that was one of them. Mm-hmm. And finally, one of them got published, and I read from a book at a conference that was in progress that wasn't Election, and a person there was a screenwriter said, you should talk to these producers, I think they would like your book. And my book wasn't done, but I talked to the producers and I said, I have this book in my drawer that I can't get published, because everyone thought it felt like a young adult novel. It was a book about a high school election, but it was full of sex and politics, and so it didn't make sense as a young adult book. Anyway, they said they would like to take a look, and at that point in the late 90s, Hollywood was making a lot of dark teen movies, and Election kind of really fit into that. And so the book got published only because it was already becoming a movie.
But what was it like as a writer, having created this character who you then see on screen in this kind of really, really enduring and powerful performance? Did that change the way that you thought about Tracy at all? Did it color your perception of her?
Well, it certainly made me respect the power of film.
Yeah.
And it changed my career. I started to do a lot of screenwriting myself and got very interested in making film and TV because I'd always dreamed of writing books that would be part of a cultural conversation. It seemed like one of the reasons to be a novelist. And the fact was that until my work was made into really good movies and TV shows, I think it connected with individual readers, but it was not like a subject of a cultural conversation. And so I think that part of it really was illuminating to me. And I think some writers don't care about that, as much maybe as I did. But it really felt I wanted to reach a wide audience, and it felt like I could do that more through these adaptations than I could have through just writing my books.
Yeah. Was there anything, when you returned to Tracy, did you reread Election? Do you reread your own novels?
Yeah, well, I had to in this case because I knew that it was sort of the urtext, and Tracy Flick Can't Win was going to be in a conversation with Election. And, one of the things it actually was a little bit of a relief to me. Like, I thought maybe that I had written these sex scenes in a way that would make me cringe, and it didn't. I felt like I really was gave Tracy some vulnerability in those scenes, and I understood that it wasn't me sort of projecting onto her a certain kind of defiance. I realized like Tracy was getting her energy from a certain kind of feminism that was really strong in the early 90s. I noticed that there were many allusions to Madonna in the book, and that sort of, when you think about feminism now, it's very focused on trauma and protecting women. And I think back then there was a much sort of bolder and powerful current in feminism, which was, you can behave like a man, you can get whatever you want, you can do whatever you want. And I think Tracy was plugged into that kind of power feminism. I'm sure there's another word for it. And I think in Tracy Flick Can't Win, we meet Tracy. She's a middle-aged assistant principal. She hasn't fulfilled her dreams of a political career. And she's looking back and starting to realize that, that she wasn't as extraordinary an individual as she believed, and that there was something systemic about that. She was a kind of representative woman rather than a unique superhero.
Why did you want to place her in that context? Because I think at the end of the movie, which differs from the book, she's working in Washington, she's working for a Republican senator, and she seems to sort of be on this powerful path, like this girl-bossery trajectory. What made you want to not have her on that course?
I think I'm really interested in ambition as a subject, but I also feel like even for people who have achieved a lot, I think dissatisfaction with where you are is a kind of a universal human experience, and it's something that has really interested me as a writer. And I don't know, it just felt right to say that there's a Tracy Flick in every high school, and not everybody ends up being the senator from New Jersey. And I want, she's got a PhD, she's a professional, she owns a home, she has a child. By every ordinary human standard, she's a success. But she did not, her goals weren't ordinary. And so she feels like a failure. And so, like many middle-aged people, she's looking at her life and saying, how do I account for the discrepancy between what I dreamed of and what I got?
Yeah. It's interesting too because, like as you mentioned, we're in this period of revisionism, thinking about women in the 90s in the public eye who were not treated fairly, and certainly the reception to Tracy at the time, particularly to the way that she was played in the movie, was quite hostile, shall we say. So it was interesting to me reading Tracy Flick Can't Win that in some ways the culture has not evolved that much. Like, she's still not in a world that appreciates her talents, that has come to appreciate women that are powerful, ambitious, strivers. And in some ways it is a progression for her, but it's not quite what we would want.
No, and Tracy Flick Can't Win. It's in the title, you know, you can hear it. I mean, it really was a reaction to the 2016 election. There was just that sense somehow that the culture did not have a paradigm for what a female leader would look like, and to the point, you know, where like the most toxic version of a male leader was able to win over the much more qualified, intelligent, competent person, you know, and I did feel like there was just some sense that we haven't gotten there yet. We have not found our paradigm. And this was one lesson to me about Tracy. One of the reasons she became a kind of archetype was that there were not fictional representations of female politicians. We didn't have female politicians, you know. I mean, there are a few outliers in American history. But, you know, when I wrote Election in the early 90s, I'm not sure that I had read a book or seen a movie about a woman who was a political leader.
Yeah.
You just realize how recent the history is in that sense. And I don't, you know, we have to find that paradigm. We have to build it. But and it may be something that some of us may not like. You know, if well, you know, I mean, Margaret Thatcher certainly exists as a, and that's a very old sort of, you know, paradigm of the woman who has, you know, kind of gotten beyond femininity or eliminated a certain kind of femininity, like the Iron Lady.
Yeah, like the Queen too in some ways. Yeah. What is it about the landscape of American suburbia and high schools in particular that feels like such fertile terrain for you? Like, what interests you about that setting?
Yeah, you know, I write about teachers all the time, and I write about high school quite a bit, and sometimes I'm a little embarrassed about that. But as I've gotten older, I just realized there are some writers who just have a subject, you know. Philip Roth just kept going back to Newark in different ways, and the way he treated it changed over the course of his career, but that small place as his subject never changed. And for me, I think there are a couple things. So I went to a working class public high school in New Jersey, and then I went to Yale. And so I had the culture shock of, you know, going from quote unquote real America to elite America. And it did make me feel like, oh, that was America. That was the last time I belonged to like a broad community. And it has stuck with me as a kind of microcosm for America. And you see it now in our politics, by the way, right? What gets taught in high school, you know, whether it's critical race theory or, you know, gender identity or sex education. These are burning political issues, and that, you know, certainly they influenced the governor's election and most recently in Virginia, but are also going to be very prominent in the midterms. So I think that our democracy actually often happens at this level of the school, and the school is the place where like our one generation tries to pass on values to another generation during a time of like huge cultural change. And I think it's there's something about that space that feels like, you know, people say, oh, the states are laboratories of democracy, but I think like public schools are real laboratories of democracy. And there's something about the position of the teacher, that really interests me. I think it's in the same way, I guess you could write about, clergy as well, or something. Just this idea of these very imperfect people trying to do this impossible job. Seems like a really important human story.
Yeah. I wanted to talk to you about women. There's a theme here. You have the most amazing, abiding sympathy and empathy for all your characters, even the really, really crappy ones. But you seem, I think, particularly attuned to how much harder life can be for your female characters, whereas the men, I think, often are born into privilege or luck or blessings that they don't always appreciate. So how do you research your female characters? How do you get inside their heads, and do you think there are common threads between them?
So, when I started, I was often grouped with Nick Hornby as a kind of, there would be a table at the bookstore called Ladlit. Yeah. Because I wrote a book about a wedding band, these rock musicians who played in a wedding band, and I think that, but also my first book, Bad Haircut, is all about male friendship. And Election was actually the book that changed it for me. I wanted to tell this story from a multitude of perspectives in first person, and so that meant I had to create believable women characters. And now there's a very fraught discussion in literary circles about who can tell what stories and when you can step outside of your own identity. And it wasn't fraught in that way when I did it. But it was fraught as a literary challenge for me. Can I, as a man, create a believable woman character? And I think I just did what actors do, which was try to find some part of me that connected with some part of that character. So for Tracy, I was connecting with that part of me that was ambitious and felt like I was coming from nowhere and had to, fight for everything, and then Tammy, who's the other character in Election, she's the young queer woman who is sort of the Ross Perot of that story. She's the subversive candidate. And for her, I tried to give her all of my, sort of sardonic, wise guy, whatever part of my personality was there. And I wrote that book, and especially with Tracy, I would, for years after, I would do book groups, and women would come up to me and just say, I was Tracy. And it was, and they weren't saying I was, abrasive and unpleasant. They were saying I was the girl with her hand up. I was the one who was trying really hard. I was the one who was president of all the clubs. I believed I could conquer the world. And they were, and I thought, okay, I wrote a character who people felt seen by. And it gave me a certain kind of confidence to start to write these women characters. I think, Little Children was a book that had, it was about a stay-at-home mom and a stay-at-home dad who started an affair at the local pool. And what I'm really, I think, writing about is the way that feminism is sort of making its way through our intimate lives over the past several decades. Because I remember being in college, and my generation was this post-Roe v. Wade generation, and I think we thought we could remake marriage into a more fair institution. Women could join the workforce and have careers. And, in many ways, these things have happened over time, but they've happened slowly and imperfectly. And equality is always this thing that's shimmering over here just beyond our actual lives. But how feminism has empowered women, destabilized marriage, forced men to change or not, resist, has really been the subject, I think, of a lot of my work, as well as, teachers in schools. Those are my go-to spots.
Yeah. I think we have to leave it here. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
got a letter today from Auntie Lizzie. She said Bo's been working the fields.
Oh. Can't imagine.
Oh, he just doesn't understand how different things are in Mississippi. Are you listening?
Yes.
Be small down there.
Like this?
Emmett never thought anything would happen to him.
Meet the mummy, Simmy!
He just wanted to go on vacation and have fun with his cousins. But if my son could just get his feet back onto the Chicago soil, he'd be one happy kid. I don't know why I said that.
I want to talk to you about that boy.
They've come for you. It's hard to describe what a mother knows. The first thing I noticed when I became a mother was that my hands were busy all the time. My hand knew him with my eyes closed, just like I know his laughter in a crowded room. It's the same thing when you know all of someone. This was my boy, Emmett Till.
The body of Emmett Lewis Till has been found dead.
Can I at least just fix him up a bit?
No, they have to see it for themselves.
You tell me, Mamie, how is risking your life gonna help him?
Those pictures of your son change people's lives.
I can't look, Mamie. We have to. The lynching of my son has shown me that what happens to any of us, anywhere in the world, had better be the business of us all.
And now for a conversation about the feature film Till, please welcome Chinonye Chukwu, co-writer and director of Till. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Vann R. Newkirk II.
Hello. How y'all doing?
Oh, yeah. I don't want it to be too much like a library up in here. We're going to be loud.
Thanks for coming.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to introduce you today to filmmaker, educator, and social justice advocate, Chinonye Chukwu. In 2019, Chinonye wrote and directed the film Clemency, which won the U.S. Dramatic Grand Jury Prize at Sundance and garnered rave reviews, including my own. Clemency was recognized with nominations from Film Independent for Spirit Awards, the Gotham Awards, and was recognized throughout a slew of international film festivals. Most recently, and what you all just watched the trailer for, Chinonye directed and co-wrote the feature film Till, based on the true story of Mamie Till Mobley and her pursuit of justice for her son, Emmett Lewis Till, who was murdered in Mississippi in 1955 at the age of 14. The film will have its world premiere as a spotlight screening at the New York Film Festival on October 1st, and it will be released in theaters on October 14th, right? It is wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, this story for me, for my family, it's one that for a lot of black families in America is sort of foundational. I grew up hearing the story of Emmett Till, of what happened. I had the jet and ebony covers on the walls in my home. For this story that for so many Americans is kind of their bedrock, and for another part of America is often never talked about. Can you tell me about why now? What drew you to this story now?
Well, this is a story that is embedded in the fabric of American history, but also our American present. And the what it navigates is something that's not just specific to America or exclusive to America, you know, and this is a wound in particularly American history that that has not been fully addressed, and especially right now where there's a movement in certain states to erase history like this and to erase entire cultures of people and communities of people and the foundations that this country was built on, which includes a racialized, violent history. You know, it's now more important than ever to make sure that this history is not erased. You know, and also we're still living it. You know, history is continuing to repeat itself over and over and over again, and there are lessons that we can learn. And there's also, what I do in the film is begin to explore the freedom work that Mamie and other activists really did that continues to this day. And so we're continuing the legacy of people like not just Mamie, but also Myrlie Evers and Medgar Evers, Dr. T.R.M. Howard, who I think is a great unsung hero that a lot of people don't know about, but he was critical in civil rights movements and helping freedom fighters do the work that they do. And so all of those are the reasons why I believe that now more than ever is the time to make this film and share it with the world.
Now, you mentioned T.R.M. Howard. I
Yes.
believe that's the first time I've seen him in film.
I think so.
And if you all don't know, T.R.M. Howard is one of the titans of the early civil rights movement. My mom's from Greenwood. My aunt was born in Taborian Hospital, Mount Bayou.
Oh, there we go.
So we know T.R.M. well.
Yes. He helped build the hospital, fund the hospital in Mount Bayou. And if y'all don't know about Mount Bayou, Google Mount Bayou, Dr. Howard. Yes.
So the next question for me is, can you tell me more about the research that went into this?
Yes, so the research really started a few decades ago. You know, so one of our producers, Keith Beauchamp, was a mentee of Mamie's when she was alive, and he had spent about 30 years of his life not only learning more about the story, but also helping to reopen the case. And trying, and which is ongoing to this day. And then the other producers got on board trying to make this film for about 20 years. And so they have formed relationships with family members of Mamie and Emmett. They have really form relationships with the community members who are a part of this story. And so all of that research, all of that work and those relationships were passed on to me when I was approached to make this film 3 years ago. And so I had to spend a bit of time playing catch up on that research and forming my own relationships with people and going to Mississippi and going to Chicago. And so all of that informed the writing of the script and the directing of the film.
Now, the film traces the journey of Mamie Till Mobley from a very traumatic incident in her life to one where she is, and this is not a spoiler because it happened in real life, I'm sorry, but to one where she is the face of a portion of this movement. Can you tell us more about, I guess, the story I learned wasn't really about Mamie. It was about the country. It was about this incident and then the country. And there's this interstitial piece of Mamie that doesn't really get talked about.
Yes.
What was it like to delve into her story and how she grew as a person?
It was the only way that I could imagine telling this story, because without Mamie, the world, we wouldn't know who Emmett Till was. And so she is the heartbeat of the story, the center, the core. And Black women especially so often get erased from history and our present, but especially these freedom movements as well. And we're oftentimes foundational to them in getting this work done. And so it was a non-negotiable for me to center Mamie. And it was such an incredible honor to be able to present her to the world in a way that is humanizing, in a way that is layered, and that really shows her in a multidimensional way that goes beyond just grieving mother. But she was a real person, you know, and I also wanted the opportunity to while she did she did work that's so courageous and so critical to our civil rights movements, but I also wanted to take her off of a historical pedestal and make her feel real and lived in, and so all audiences across races and genders and et cetera, could really empathize with her emotional journey.
Now, last we spoke, you were doing the press tour for Clemency.
Yes.
And that was 2019, I believe? 2019. It's, been a few years since then.
Mm-hmm.
Been an interesting few years since then.
Yeah.
What have you learned in that interim and in the making of this film?
What have I learned creatively?
Yes.
I've learned a couple things. I've learned the power of not showing everything. For my last film, Clemency, I was really intentional about how much I show when it comes to, so that's a film that follows this kind of emotional down spiral of a prison warden as she prepares to execute a man on death row. And what I learned, there's a critical scene near the end where the warden is overseeing an execution, and throughout the course of that execution, over the span of minutes in real time, I chose to stay on the warden's face the entire time. And we are experiencing that execution and the effects of it through her facial reaction. Mm-hmm. And what I learned in making Clemency, and particularly in that shot, was that sometimes it's that much, you can communicate the horror, the pain, much more by what you don't show than what you do show. And I really took that to heart when it comes to what I chose to show and not show with Till. So I was really intentional for a couple different reasons to not show the physical violence that was inflicted upon Emmett. We could clap. For a couple different reasons. One, I don't want to see it or recreate it as a person in general, but especially a Black person. I also wanted to take care of audiences as well. Mm-hmm. But the story is not about that, right? And it's when Mamie made the decision for the world to see what happened to her son, they saw the effects of it. And it was so harrowing to see the aftermath, as people can imagine what was done to him, and so there was something so powerful about that I wanted to keep that. I wanted to do an extension of that in the film. So withhold from that physical violence, but we see the effects of it, at the viewing, and when Mamie is seeing the body for the first time. So that was a critical kind of narrative lesson that I really learned through making Clemency.
No. To extend that for a bit, this film enters, I think, a really interesting conversation in American and Black film where we're thinking about trauma, mm-hmm. about the role of trauma. And it's hard to access that conversation mm-hmm. without recognizing the fact that mm-hmm. Black film, as you all know it in this room, has only existed this way for a decade or two, right? For being able to have the ability to tell these stories.
Yes.
How does this film enter that debate? What are your thoughts about how we show, deal with, utilize, and learn from trauma in Black history?
Well, I think we need a much more complicated conversation around what is trauma, right? I think it's how you tell the story. And because you are exploring a hardship or challenge or a traumatic event, it doesn't take away from the joy and the love and the community that can exist alongside that narrative. Me as a Black woman, my joy is a form of resistance, and even though I live in the world where every facet of this world is trying to erase me, kill me, incarcerate me, et cetera, that doesn't take away from the joy and the love and the self-empowerment that is also a part of my existence and a part of my story, right? And so that was my approach in making Till, and I think that can help complicate these conversations around trauma and Black trauma instead of just getting rid of all films or TV shows or stories that have moments of pain. It undermines the larger narrative and also those moments of joy and life and laughter and love that can also exist alongside it. Because that's my reality as a Black person in this world, particularly America, and I'm sure yours and many other people's who's part of any marginalized group. And so that's kind of how I view it.
A couple weeks ago, I was out in the Delta. I was in Drew. They had, for the first time ever, a ceremony and memorialization of the killing of Emmett Till. And it was something that you asked the Black residents in Drew if they had thought this would ever be possible 5 years ago. They said no. And one thing that was a topic of discussion among a lot of them was this film, Till. A lot of them felt the same way, that there would not be a film, a serious treatment about this killing, about what it meant to that community. I'm wondering if you've heard any feedback from people in the Delta, from people who were tightly connected to this, as to what this film means to them.
We've had a lot of internal screenings. One of the ones that really resonated with me, Myrlie Evers, watched the film. Myrlie watched the film, and we portray Myrlie in the film significantly, and she has been a big supporter of the film and talked with the actor playing Myrlie and the actor playing Medgar, and she's always been a huge resource of information for the many years that the producers have been trying to get this film made. And so her watching the film and her incredible reaction to it just it filled me up deeply. We've had members of the Till family watch the film as well, and we're very moved by it. We've had members of the executive branch of the NAACP watch it. Some of them worked alongside Mamie at the time in the 50s, and so watching it with them was, nerve-wracking. But
they're fact-checking you live.
I know, I was like, oh my God, I gotta make sure that, I grew up in Alaska, so I'm just like, woo, what are they gonna think about me and how I portray the South in Chicago? But it was, Alaska's just a little different than Greenwood.
Hey, I'm a Southerner. I think you got it all right.
Okay, woo! And so it was, I've had an incredible affirming response, and even people who've lived this story. One woman who's an executive member at the NAACP, she worked alongside Mamie in the 50s, and she worked with Medgar, and she knew a lot of the people personally who were portrayed in the story. And she said, oh, I was gripped. I was just trying to, I couldn't wait to see what was going to happen next. And I was like, but you were there. But okay, score. So that was a big compliment.
Now, you all may be able to tell from the trailer, but one thing I found when I was watching this film was the acting performances are some of the best you'll see. I think you look at Danielle Deadwyler.
Oh, Danielle
amazing.
Deadwyler. Let's just give an applause for Danielle Deadwyler.
I guess for me, what's the secret sauce? How do you get that out of people?
Well, first you cast Danielle Deadwyler because she's brilliant on her own. But she one of the reasons why I cast her was because, and this is what I look for when I cast actors, particularly in a leading role, is can they communicate with their eyes? How can they hold a screen? Can they communicate non-verbally with their bodies? And Danielle's eyes are so expressive, and you've seen the film, so there's a 6 minute, there's that long take when she's testifying.
The long take when she's testifying. Yeah, yeah.
Not many actors can do that like she did.
I think my notebook is just wow.
Yeah. I mean, the work Danielle does in this film, so we spent several months diving deeply into research and also going through every emotional beat of the script multiple times. And so I tend to do that I did that with Alfre as well. We spend months just prepping and diving in and really getting to a place of total emotional immersion. And so by the time we're on set, she then began to have this inherent understanding of who Mamie was, and she channeled Mamie physically, emotionally, spiritually. It was incredible to witness.
Well, on that note, I think you all should go and witness it.
Yes.
Chinonye, thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you
wonderful
so
to
much.
have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Please spread the word.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome back to the stage, The Atlantic's Candace Montgomery.
Thank you all for joining us these last 3 days. The festival has been phenomenal. I hope that you have all enjoyed. I want to thank all of our generous sponsors, our underwriters, for their support of the Atlantic's journalism and for the festival. Without their support, the festival would not be possible. I want to also remind you all that you can join us on social. We want to see how you've been following along by using TAF 2022, and invite you over to the pier for our last and final Sunset Jam and Happy Hour with DJ Mick if you are over 21. I hope you all have enjoyed the festival, and we hope to see you all next year. Thank you.